If you find yourself frustrated by the minimum focusing distance of your lens, if you constantly find that you are unable to frame the shot you want because you can't get close enough to focus, then you may want to consider extension tubes. An extension tube is an attachment that goes between your camera body and your lens. It's not an optical element. There's no glass in here. All it does is get the lens further from the focal plane. Now, the practical upshot of this is that your minimum focusing distance gets smaller. So with an extension tube, you can get closer to your subject, you can fill the frame with more of it, and still achieve focus. For example, I've got my 24 to 105 millimeter lens here, and this is as close as I can get to this flower. I've zoomed in all the way, and notice the way I'm focusing, just like we talked about before. I'm moving forward and back. This is as close as I can get, which gets me this shot. Nice enough, but I'd like to get in closer. So I'm going to add one of these extension tubes. I have 3 of them, and we're going to talk about the difference in a minute. Extension tubes simply go on your camera body like a lens. So I'm going to take my lens off and put an extension tube on. I'm using the shortest one. Goes right there. The reason I'm choosing the shortest one is I don't want to go in real far. I just want a little bit of extra boost. So I'm now going to attach the lens to the extension tube. So you can see I've got a little bit of extension. That's going to let me get a little bit closer. So now with that extension tube, I can get into here. Now there's a trade-off that I have to suffer here, and that is that the extension tube takes some light. So I may have to go to a higher ISO, I may have to go to a wider aperture. If I go to a wider aperture, then I'm going to have less depth of field. So there's this trade-off of magnification versus depth of field. But what's nice is I got in tighter. I'm not going to have to crop my image in post-production. I get to use more of the pixels in my camera. You can use extension tubes with any type of lens, prime or zoom, a regular lens or a macro. They are an inexpensive way to get the kind of short focusing distances that you get from a dedicated and much more expensive macro lens. Now, extension tubes come in different sizes. I have a set of 3 here. I've got one that is 13 millimeters. I've got one that's a little bit longer at 21, and another one that's longer still at 31, I believe, yeah. And I can stack these together. And as I stack them, they get longer, and as they get longer, I get more extension, which means more magnification power. So I can go all the way up to here, and if I put this on my camera, I'm going to be able to get all the way into full macro range, and that's going to open up all of the macro concerns and practices that I'm going to need to think about as I'm shooting in that close, and those are the things we're going to learn when we get to true macro lenses. The effectiveness of extension tubes decreases as focal length increases. In other words, you're going to see more of a change sticking this stack onto a 50 millimeter lens than you will when you put it onto a 300 millimeter lens. You also need to be careful when working with extreme wide angle lenses. If I put this 65 millimeter stack of tubes on a 20 millimeter lens, I won't be able to focus at all because my minimum focusing distance will be pulled back into the inside of the lens. So one other very important thing to understand about extension tubes, some of them have electrical contacts that allow your camera to communicate with your lens, and some don't. If you get tubes that don't, then you won't have autofocus or aperture control. Now, Canon and Nikon both make sets of active extension tubes, that is, ones that have these contacts, and while they work great, they're very expensive. This is a set of Kenko extension tubes with a Canon mount. I can get these with other mounts, Nikon and other mounts. That's Kenko. They have all the correct contacts, and they give me full auto controls, but they cost much less than the Canon tubes. Extension tubes are a very affordable way to start getting into a lot more magnification power. What's more, they're small, they're very light, they're easy to carry. If you're worried about whether you should invest in extension tubes or go ahead and invest in a true macro lens, bear in mind that sometimes you'll need to get a macro lens closer to your subject, so you'll continue to use extension tubes even if you eventually buy a macro lens. In the meantime, they're a great way to start experimenting with getting closer and even experimenting with true macro ranges, as we'll see later.